Picture this. General Franz Halder stands utterly motionless in the dimly lit war room of the Wolf's Lair, Wolfschanze, Hitler's sprawling and heavily fortified headquarters buried deep in the dense forests of East Prussia. The date is July 23rd, 1942. Outside, the humid air hangs heavy with the smell of pine and diesel. Inside, the atmosphere is electric with dread. Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, had just witnessed something that made his blood run cold. Moments earlier, Hitler had taken the carefully drawn operational maps for Kamasi Case Blue. Germany's critical summer offensive aimed at seizing the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, and in a fit of rage ripped them apart in front of his stunned generals. Those plans had taken weeks of precise calculations and logistics, balancing every available tank, truck, and man in the Wehrmacht. They were the product of years of military doctrine distilled into one complex but coherent campaign. Yet Hitler, armed with a red pencil and volcanic fury, scribbled over them like a mad artist, vandalizing his own canvas. He rewrote entire army movements by instinct, splitting forces that depended on one another for survival, issuing contradictory orders that no rational commander would approve. He demanded simultaneous drives toward both Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields, two directions hundreds of miles apart, each requiring the full strength of the army. But it wasn't the strategic chaos that truly paralyzed Halder. It was what he saw in Hitler's face as he screamed and ranted, veins bulging, his complexion darkening to a purplish hue. Spittle flew from his mouth as he berated his generals for their cowardice and defeatism. Hitler's hands were trembling uncontrollably. His left leg twitched in erratic spasms that seemed to have a rhythm of their own. His pupils were dilated, his eyes bloodshot and glassy, the unmistakable side effects of the methamphetamine injections given to him daily by his personal physician, Dr. Fedor Morel. His speech was manic, darting from topic to topic, from Jewish conspiracies to cosmic destiny, from tactical minutiae to divine prophecy, as if reality itself had splintered in his mind. For 2 long years, Halder had made excuses for this behavior. He had told himself that perhaps the stress of running a war on multiple fronts had simply warped Hitler's temper. He'd rationalized the rants as unorthodox leadership, maybe even flashes of inspiration, but standing there in that suffocating bunker, surrounded by maps, charts, and men too afraid to breathe, Halder felt the truth pierce through him like a cold knife. Hitler was no longer rational. He wasn't merely furious or extreme. He had crossed the invisible line into madness, and Halder wasn't alone in that realization. Across the German High Command, the same unsettling awareness was spreading, not in one sudden epiphany, but as a creeping horror. Incident after incident, bizarre order after bizarre order, each one eroding the illusion that the Führer was a strategic genius. Together, they formed a terrifying pattern. The man commanding the most powerful army in Europe had lost touch with reality itself. For Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, that realization came months earlier on December 18th, 1941, outside the frozen ruins near Moscow. The Wehrmacht had come within sight of the Kremlin's spires before the Soviet counteroffensive slammed into them with brutal force. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees C, engines froze solid, men died standing up, their rifles still in their hands. Von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, requested permission to pull back to more defensible lines, a standard tactical move in any winter campaign. Hitler's reply came through the teleprinter like a death sentence. No retreat. Not one step back. Units will hold their positions even if surrounded. Any officer who ordered a withdrawal without his express approval would face court-martial and execution. Von Bock read the order 3 times, unable to believe his eyes. This wasn't strategy. It was suicide disguised as courage. Entire divisions were already encircled, cut off from supplies, freezing and starving. They were being commanded to die in place. He tried reasoning with Hitler, using careful military phrasing to argue that a limited withdrawal could save tens of thousands of lives without losing ground in the long term. Hitler's response was swift and merciless. Von Bock was dismissed. Even then, von Bock didn't call Hitler insane. Not yet. Fanatic, yes. Ideologically blinded, absolutely. But he still clung to the hope that there was method in the madness. That changed during his final face-to-face meeting with Hitler shortly before his dismissal. For 30 uninterrupted minutes, Hitler lectured him on why the Soviet Union was biologically incapable of long-term warfare. The Slavic peoples, he claimed, were racially inferior and would crumble under sustained pressure. When von Bock gently pointed out that the Soviets had just recaptured Kalinin and Tula, costing Germany over 50,000 casualties, Hitler waved it off as temporary setbacks caused by traitors. That's when von Bock finally saw it. Hitler wasn't lying for propaganda. He believed every word. His racial theories had replaced reason, turning into a closed-loop delusion that no evidence could penetrate. When the facts contradicted ideology, Hitler simply rejected the facts. That wasn't stubbornness anymore. It was psychosis. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, had his moment of awakening on March 21st, 1943. Reinstated as Inspector General of Armored Troops after being sidelined for past disagreements, Guderian threw himself into rebuilding Germany's shattered tank divisions. His reports were blunt and mathematical. Germany was producing roughly 600 tanks a month, but losing 800 just on the Eastern Front. Even before Allied bombing crippled production, the numbers made it clear that the Wehrmacht was bleeding faster than it could be replenished. When Guderian presented this to Hitler, complete with charts, production graphs and loss tables, he expected argument, perhaps denial. Instead, Hitler calmly dismissed the data. He insisted that German industry would multiply output through willpower, and that morale would compensate for steel. The German spirit, he said, is worth 10 Soviet tanks. Guderian was stunned. Hitler wasn't debating projections, he was rewriting physical reality in his own head. When Guderian pointed out that tank production had actually declined, for 6 straight months, Hitler accused him of defeatism and threatened to have him arrested for treasonous pessimism. That was the moment Guderian understood. He was serving a man no longer capable of distinguishing between belief and fact. Hitler's delusions had become self-sustaining, impervious to logic or evidence. His orders were no longer grounded in strategy, but in ideology and hallucination. And then there was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the oldest and most respected officers in the German army. His clarity came earlier than anyone's during the planning of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. At one meeting, Rundstedt asked a simple, sober question. What will we do if the Soviet Union does not collapse immediately? Hitler's eyes flared with disbelief. It will collapse, he declared. We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Rundstedt pressed on. What if the Soviets retreated deeper into their vast territory, trading space for time? What if the campaign stretched into winter? Hitler grew visibly agitated. He shouted that such scenarios were impossible, that the Red Army would be destroyed in 6 to 8 weeks, that Moscow would fall by autumn. When Rundstedt mentioned Napoleon's failed 1812 invasion, a warning from history, Hitler exploded, screaming that the comparison was treasonous. Germany's racial superiority, he claimed, made victory inevitable. From that day, Rundstedt knew the truth. The man leading them was not merely reckless or arrogant. He was detached from reality itself. His worldview was no longer anchored in facts or even strategy. It was a fantasy constructed from ideology, ego, and the blind faith of a drug-fueled prophet. By 1942, most of Germany's professional soldiers had seen glimpses of this unraveling mind. Some whispered about it behind closed doors, others convinced themselves that their Führer's genius would prevail one more time. But deep down, they all knew what Franz Halder finally admitted to himself, that summer in the wolf's lair. The fate of Germany and of millions lay in the hands of a man who had gone completely insane, and no one had the courage to stop him. General Franz Halder stood frozen in the war room deep inside the wolf's lair, Hitler's heavily guarded headquarters buried within the forests of East Prussia. It was July 23, 1942, a sweltering afternoon outside, but inside the thick concrete bunker, the air was icy with tension. For several minutes, no one dared to breathe as Hitler erupted into a volcanic rage. Maps and documents littered the massive oak table. The Führer's voice, normally sharp and clipped, now rose to a hoarse, furious roar. He shredded the carefully drawn plans for König's Blum, Germany's grand summer offensive in the Soviet Union, replacing weeks of professional military planning with his own chaotic scrawls. The outburst went on for 15 unbearable minutes. Hitler shouted, cursed, and accused his generals of cowardice and sabotage. He threatened to strip Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt of command, even before the invasion had fully begun. His face was crimson, sweat glistening under the harsh lamps, and his gestures were wild and uncontrolled. Halder, the seasoned chief of the general staff, had seen angry commanders before, but this was something else. This was madness, raw, unrestrained, and terrifying. The rational discipline of the German military machine had collided with the unstable will of a man who no longer distinguished between reality and fantasy. For Halder, that moment was an epiphany, but for others the revelation came later, often amid the smoking ruins of their own commands. One of them was General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army. By January 1943, Paulus was trapped in Stalingrad, surrounded by Soviet forces and buried beneath a blizzard of ice, hunger, and despair. He was a man of precision and obedience, a product of Prussian discipline, who followed orders with absolute loyalty. Even as his soldiers froze in the shattered ruins of the city, even as food and ammunition ran out, Paulus clung to Hitler's promises that relief forces were on their way. Each radio message from headquarters carried the same hollow assurances. Hold out, help is coming. Then on the Schnelle January 24, 1943, Paulus received word that Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal B. The message seemed absurd. His army was collapsing, tens of thousands of his men were already dead or dying, and now a promotion. But the meaning was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in history. The honor came with an unspoken order, die rather than surrender. Hitler fully expected Paulus to take his own life, turning the destruction of the Sixth Army into a tragic legend of loyalty unto death. Paulus sat silently in his underground bunker as snow drifted through the shattered ceiling above. Outside, the moans of frostbitten soldiers echoed between bombed-out buildings. He stared at the promotion paper in disbelief, realizing the grotesque theater at play. To Hitler, the lives of 91,000 soldiers meant nothing compared to preserving the myth of invincible German heroism. He wasn't commanding armies anymore. He was directing a macabre stage play where symbols outweighed human lives. That night, Paulus understood the terrible truth. Hitler's decisions were not strategic. They were ritualistic sacrifices to his own delusions. The dictator had crossed the line from reckless leadership into a world of pure fantasy. Paulus made the only sane decision left. He surrendered. He knew the humiliation would haunt him for life, but he refused to participate in Hitler's death cult. Better to live with guilt than to die for madness. The same realization came to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, though his awakening unfolded more gradually. Rommel had been one of Hitler's favorites, the desert fox immortalized in German propaganda for his daring campaigns in North Africa. He was charismatic, pragmatic, and loved by his troops. But Rommel was also a realist. He understood logistics, supply lines, and the brutal math of modern warfare. When the African campaign collapsed, Rommel was reassigned to France to inspect and fortify the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's grand defensive line against the anticipated Allied invasion. Rommel's reports were thorough, honest, and grim. He warned that the coastline was too long to defend everywhere, that Allied air superiority made rapid troop movements impossible, and that Germany's only hope was to crush the invasion on the beaches within 48 hours. Hitler ignored every recommendation. In conferences, he dismissed Rommel's concerns with sweeping gestures and childlike confidence. "The Anglo-American soldiers are weak," he proclaimed. "They lack the will to fight." He spoke of miracle weapons, jet planes, rockets, new submarines that would make Germany invincible again. When Rommel presented intelligence estimates showing millions of Allied troops and thousands of ships preparing to invade, Hitler brushed it off as enemy propaganda. Rommel's final confrontation came in March 1944 during a meeting at Berchtesgaden. He had just returned from another exhausting coastal inspection and tried, one last time, to inject realism into Hitler's fantasies. He suggested negotiating a political settlement with the Western Allies, perhaps turning Germany's strength toward the Soviet Union. The real existential threat, Hitler responded with a rambling, 2-hour monologue about destiny, divine providence, and secret weapons that would soon change everything. He described squadrons of jet aircraft that didn't exist, fleets of new U-boats that hadn't been built, and rocket systems that were years from mass production. His eyes gleamed with fanatic intensity. To him, these imaginary weapons were already real. Rommel sat motionless, realizing that Germany's fate was sealed. Its leader was living in a hallucination, commanding from a dream world where willpower replaced logic and technology replaced truth. As Rommel walked out of the meeting, he knew Germany was finished. Its ruler was no longer a strategist. He was a man possessed by delusion. The most chilling realization, however, came to those who saw Hitler up close in the final years. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a brilliant officer from an old aristocratic family, attended many of Hitler's command meetings in 1943 and 1944. He witnessed the physical and mental decay firsthand. Hitler's left hand trembled uncontrollably. His right leg dragged behind him like dead weight. His face had turned ashen, his eyes often glassy and unfocused, sometimes rolling back during meetings. He looked decades older than his 54 years. Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Fedor Morel, had become his pharmaceutical enabler, injecting him daily with an unholy cocktail of methamphetamine, barbiturates, testosterone, opioids, and vitamin compounds. These drugs kept Hitler alert, but also fueled violent mood swings, paranoia, and delusional thinking. Stauffenberg watched, horrified, as Hitler swung from manic euphoria to volcanic rage to exhausted despair, sometimes all within a single briefing. Facts no longer mattered. Logic had vanished. Reality itself had become negotiable. By July 1944, as the Allies prepared to storm France, Hitler outlined his grand plan to repel them. The strategy relied on divisions that no longer existed, on tank formations destroyed months earlier, and on air support from a Luftwaffe that had been annihilated. When officers tried to explain that many of these units were gone, Hitler accused them of treason. When they showed casualty records proving it, he called the reports forgeries by traitors. He was commanding phantom armies. That was when Stauffenberg realized the only solution left was assassination. Diplomacy, persuasion, or reason were useless against a man who lived in a hallucination. Killing him was the only way to save what was left of Germany. July 20th, 1944. Bomb plot nearly succeeded. The explosion in the Wolf's Lair tore through the conference room, killing several officers and leaving Hitler injured but alive. His survival turned delusion into vengeance. He became more paranoid than ever, purging the officer corps, executing thousands. and spending his final months issuing orders to imaginary divisions while the real army collapsed. By early 1945, Hitler's commands had become absurd. He demanded counteroffensives by divisions that existed only on paper. He expected relief from armies that had already surrendered. He ordered miracle weapons that could no longer be produced. In the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet artillery thundered above, he still promised final victory within weeks. When the war finally ended, many surviving generals were asked the same haunting question: why didn't you act sooner? Some spoke of loyalty, the sacred officer's oath to the Führer. Others admitted fear that any resistance meant certain execution. A few confessed that they simply couldn't believe what they were witnessing. They told themselves it wasn't madness, only unorthodox leadership, but by the time the truth became undeniable, it was far too late. Germany's armies were shattered, its cities were burning, its people starving. The war had long since stopped being about strategy. It had become the final act of a madman's self-destruction. Hitler was no longer the calculating dictator of the 1930s. He was a broken, delusional man commanding ghost armies in a crumbling fantasy. And the tragedy, for Germany, for Europe, and for the millions who suffered, was that his generals recognized the madness only when the world he'd built was already in ashes.